The ship lies on its side in 20 feet of water, 19 feet from the wharf where it was docked. Men with acetylene torches cut rectangular holes through the steel hull, while passengers trapped inside tap Morse code signals with their fists. A photographer captures the moment. Women in white summer dresses standing on the exposed starboard side, their feet dry, while below them, separated by 3/8 of an inch of riveted plate, bodies press against portholes in the flooded cabins. The Chicago River is so shallow you could wade across it. The disaster is over in 2 minutes. 844 people die. More than the Titanic, more than the Lusitania, more passengers than any single shipwreck in the history of the Great Lakes. Then the ship gets a second life. Was this a vessel that killed through design, or a system that killed through regulation? The first time the Eastland tried to kill its passengers was 2 months after launch, in July 1903, when the ship listed severely while tourists gathered on the upper decks to watch a regatta. She was built for speed, not stability. The Jenks Shipbuilding Company of Port Huron, Michigan, delivered her in 1903 to the Michigan Steamship Company with a sleek profile, twin screws, and no keel. The original design called for 500 passengers plus cargo, produce on the return trips to Chicago from lakeside resort towns. But speed sold tickets. The narrow hull cut through water efficiently. The high superstructure gave passengers panoramic views of Lake Michigan. The ballast system in the hold, designed to counteract the top-heavy construction, responded slowly to weight distribution changes and had no side-to-side transfer capability. She earned her nickname honestly. The Eastland could outrun nearly every vessel on the Great Lakes. Advertisements promoted her as the fastest excursion steamer between Chicago and South Haven. What the advertisements didn't mention, she behaved, in the words of one transportation historian, like a bicycle, being unstable when loading or unloading, but stable when underway. The bicycle analogy held a dark implication. A bicycle falls over when stationary. On July 17, 1904, the Eastland departed South Haven with approximately 3,000 passengers aboard. In moderate conditions, the vessel rolled sharply to port, then starboard. Water flooded the main deck. Crew members scrambled to redistribute passengers to one side while pumping ballast to counteract the tilt. The ship nearly capsized in full view of the shoreline. Passengers could have stepped off onto the beach. Following this incident, the certified capacity was reduced to 2,800 persons. No structural redesign was ordered. The solution was makeshift: shift cargo, adjust ballast procedures, remove some cabins to reduce upper deck weight. The ship continued service. August 1903 brought a different kind of crisis. Several firemen refused to stoke the boilers, citing the ship's instability as a direct threat to their safety. This constituted mutiny under maritime law. Captain Harry Peru was replaced, reportedly because he sympathized with the crew's concerns. No formal charges resulted. The vessel resumed service after adjustments. In August 1906, another listing incident occurred. Complaints were filed against the Chicago-South Haven line, which had purchased the ship earlier that year. The vessel was sold to Lakeshore Navigation Company before the 1907 season and moved to Lake Erie. Different ownership, same hull, same ballast system, same high center of gravity. By 1909, when the ship was sold to Eastland Navigation Company for Cleveland to Cedar Point excursion service, she had accumulated a documented history. 1 near mutiny, 2 near capsizings, multiple ownership transfers, several capacity reductions, ongoing stability complaints. On July 1, 1912, the Iomum Eastland experienced a severe list of approximately 25 degrees while loading passengers in Cleveland. Dishes slid from pantry shelves. Some passengers disembarked immediately. The ship was righted through ballast adjustments, and the voyage proceeded. In June 1914, the vessel was sold again, this time to the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. She returned to Lake Michigan for St. Joseph to Chicago service. By this point, the Eastland had been owned by 5 different companies in 11 years. Each sale transferred not just the asset, but the accumulated knowledge of its flaws. Each new owner accepted the known instability as the price of owning a fast, profitable vessel. Naval Architect reports from this period note the ship's metacentric height, the measure of a vessel's stability, was dangerously low. The center of gravity sat too high. The ballast system remained inadequate for the ship's design. Recommendations for structural modifications were made. Those modifications were expensive. The sailing season was short on the Great Lakes, roughly April through October. Dry dock time meant lost revenue. According to later court testimony, the owners planned to postpone necessary stability repairs until after the 1915 sailing season ended. They scheduled the work for November. The disaster happened in July. 3 years before the Eastland capsized, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank with insufficient lifeboats for the 2,224 souls aboard. The public outcry was immediate and international. The image haunted lawmakers. Passengers in evening dress standing on a tilting deck watching lifeboats row away half empty because there weren't enough boats for everyone, because regulations hadn't required enough boats, because shipping companies had prioritized deck space and aesthetics over safety equipment that would probably never be needed. Senator Robert Marion La Follette of Wisconsin, in partnership with Andrew Furuseth, president of the International Seamen's Union, had been pushing maritime reform legislation since 1910. The Titanic disaster gave them the political momentum they needed. On March 4, 1915, exactly 4 months and 20 days before the Eastland disaster, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Seamen's Act into law. The legislation was comprehensive. It established a 9-hour workday and 56-hour workweek for sailors. It guaranteed minimum standards of safety and cleanliness. It recognized the right of seamen to organize. It allowed sailors to leave their contracts with minimal penalty, half their earned salary to that point. Most importantly for passenger vessels, it mandated sufficient lifeboats and life-saving equipment for every person aboard. The law applied to all ships stopping at American ports, regardless of flag. It was described as the Magna Carta of American sailors' rights. It represented 20 years of advocacy by Furuseth, who had famously described the customary 72 cubic feet of living space per sailor as too large for a coffin, too little for a grave. The law was meant to prevent another Titanic. For the Eastland, compliance meant adding lifeboats. Many lifeboats. When originally designed in 1902, the vessel was fitted for 6 lifeboats. By July 1915, she carried 11 lifeboats and 37 life rafts. Each life raft weighed approximately 100 pounds. Each life jacket weighed about 6 pounds. The ship now carried enough life jackets for 2,570 passengers and crew. Most of this safety equipment was stowed on the upper decks, the worst possible location for a top-heavy vessel with chronic stability problems. The additional weight was never tested for its effect on the ship's stability. Before the Seamen's Act became law, the general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company had testified before Congress. He warned that adding lifeboats posed risks to certain Great Lakes vessels. Ships with shallow drafts and high centers of gravity could become dangerously unstable if too many lifeboats were mounted on upper sections and decks. The added weight could cause vessels to list or capsize. His testimony was noted and set aside. The memory of the Titanic was too fresh, the political pressure too intense. The legislation passed. The lifeboats were added. No one wanted one last camping trip before the school year got busy. About a father who'd checked his tire pressure out of habit. About a mother in a blue windbreaker who'd packed sandwiches and lemonade. About a 10-year-old girl who loved Nancy Drew and a 7-year-old boy who sang Star Wars off-key. They were ordinary, he said, and that's what makes this so heartbreaking, because it could have been anyone. It could have been any family trying to enjoy a weekend in the forest. They had no reason to fear. They had no reason to expect anything other than a normal camping trip. And the fact that they encountered someone who took that away from them, someone who took everything away from them, is a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. Sometimes it's just a man in the woods with a terrible decision in his heart. After the service, Detective Vickers stood by the graves for a long time. She'd spent 18 months on this case, longer than she'd ever spent on anything else. She'd read every report from 1983. She'd interviewed everyone still alive who'd known Thomas Garrett. She'd walked the trail from the campsite to the cabin, trying to understand the logistics of what he'd done. And she'd come to a conclusion. Thomas Garrett hadn't planned this. He'd been drunk, probably, out in the woods, probably hunting or camping illegally. He'd stumbled onto the Morrison campsite. Maybe he'd startled them. Maybe they'd seen him and he'd panicked. Maybe he'd tried to talk to Linda and Dave had stepped in to protect her. Whatever the spark was, it had escalated quickly. 4 people dead in minutes. 4 lives ended because a drunk man in the woods made the worst decision a human being can make. And then he'd spent hours, maybe days, trying to cover it up, loading their bodies into his truck, driving them back to his brother's cabin, burying them in the forest, returning to the campsite to gather their belongings, hiding everything inside walls that nobody would open for 36 years. He'd lived with it for 6 more years. Did he think about it? Did it haunt him? Or had he managed to convince himself it never happened, the way some people can seal off terrible memories like they never existed? They'd never know. Thomas Garrett died in 1989, drunk behind the wheel, crashing into a tree at 60 miles per hour. Some people might call that justice. Detective Vickers called it insufficient. But at least the Morrisons were found. At least they weren't still missing, still frozen in that terrible limbo of not knowing. At least the forest had finally given up its secret. In the months after the funeral, the case remained in the news periodically. True crime podcasts covered it. Documentary producers reached out to Detective Vickers for interviews. The cabin was fully demolished. Nobody wanted it standing anymore, not after what it had hidden. The land was cleared and sold, but even now no developer has touched it. The factory covered 141 acres in Cicero, Illinois, just west of Chicago's city limits. When Western Electric opened the Hawthorne Works in 1905, it employed 2,000 workers. By 1915, the workforce had grown to over 14,000. The facility would eventually peak at 45,000 employees, making it one of the largest manufacturing complexes in the United States. The plant produced telephone equipment for the Bell system, switchboards, cable, wire harnesses, relays, switching systems. Western Electric boasted it manufactured 43,000 varieties of telephone apparatus. The workforce was predominantly immigrant. Czech, Polish, Norwegian, German, Irish, Swedish, Danish, Italian, Hungarian, and Austrian families settled in Cicero to work at Hawthorne. Many lived within walking distance of the plant. Multiple family members often worked there simultaneously: fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, cousins. The factory wasn't just an employer. It was the economic center of gravity for entire communities. Western Electric cultivated a paternalistic relationship with its workers. The company sponsored social clubs, sports teams, educational programs. The annual summer picnic was a major event, a rare Saturday off, a chance for families to spend time together away from the factory floor. Free transportation across Lake Michigan to Michigan City, Indiana, where the company had arranged food, games, parades, and sporting events. The 1915 picnic was scheduled for July 24th. It would be the 5th annual excursion. Western Electric chartered 5 steamships to transport employees and their families: the Eastland, the Theodore Roosevelt, the Petoskey, the Racine, and the Rochester. The ships were to depart from the Chicago River between LaSalle and Clark Streets, cross Lake Michigan, and dock at Michigan City. A journey of approximately 38 miles, roughly 4 hours of travel time. Approximately 7,300 people were expected to attend. The Eastland was scheduled to depart first at 7:30 a.m. She was the fastest of the 5 vessels, the most glamorous, the speed queen of the Great Lakes. For workers who spent 6 days a week inside the factory, the promise of a voyage on the Eastland added excitement to an already anticipated day. Tickets were distributed at the factory in the weeks leading up to the picnic. Employees could bring family members. Children were encouraged to attend. The company wanted to demonstrate its appreciation for the workforce, to strengthen the bond between management and labor, to show that Western Electric cared about more than just production quotas. Some workers later reported they felt the picnic was mandatory, that attendance was expected even if not explicitly required. Others said supervisors strongly encouraged participation. Whether the picnic was truly voluntary or subtly coercive became a point of dispute in subsequent investigations. What's documented, the company distributed tickets, promoted the event heavily, and expected strong turnout. The workers who boarded the Eastland that morning represented the factory's demographic cross-section. Young women who assembled telephone components, Czech immigrant families who had arrived in America within the past decade, fathers who worked as machinists and brought their children. Some employees had worked at Hawthorne since it opened. Others had been hired within the past year. Many of the passengers had never been on a boat before. The weather on July 24th was cool and damp, a light drizzle, overcast skies, temperatures in the 60s. Not ideal picnic weather, but not severe enough to cancel the event. Employees began arriving at the dock around 6 a.m. Some came with picnic baskets, others pushed baby carriages. They wore their best clothes, women in long summer dresses, men in 3-piece suits. This was a special occasion, a break from factory routine, a day to be remembered. Small bands played on the dock. The atmosphere was festive despite the drizzle. Workers greeted each other, found friends and family members, posed for photographs. The Eastland was docked on the south bank of the Chicago River, her gangplanks extended to allow boarding. At 6:30 a.m., passengers began boarding. The ship's certified capacity was 2,500 passengers. The exact number who boarded that morning remains disputed. Estimates range from 2,500 to 2,573. What's certain, the vessel was filled to or beyond its legal limit. As passengers boarded, the ship began to list. This wasn't unusual for the Eastland. Crew members had dealt with listing incidents many times before. The procedure was standard: adjust the ballast tanks, redistribute passengers if necessary, wait for the ship to right itself. The ship righted. Passengers continued boarding. By 7:10 a.m., boarding was complete. The vessel was at capacity. Deckhands prepared to cast off lines. The departure was scheduled for 7:30 a.m., and the Eastland prided itself on punctuality. Many passengers had moved below decks. The morning was cool and damp. The interior cabins offered warmth and shelter from the drizzle. Others remained on the upper decks, waving to people on shore, enjoying the view of the river. The ship listed again. To port this time, away from the wharf, toward the river. Between 7:10 a.m. and 7:28 a.m., the crew attempted to correct the list multiple times. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson opened ballast tanks to admit water on the starboard side. The ship righted briefly, then listed again, more severely. Captain Harry Paterson was an experienced officer who had sailed the Eastland many times. He knew the ship's quirks, understood her tendency to list during loading. Nothing about the morning seemed immediately catastrophic. The standard procedures were being followed. The ballast system was being managed. The ship would right itself, as it always had. At 7:25 a.m., dishes began sliding off shelves in the pantry, crashing to the floor. At 7:28 a.m., the Eastland was listing to port at least 25 degrees. Water poured through open portholes and gangways into the lower engine room. Crew members there realized what was about to happen and began scrambling up ladders to the main deck. At approximately 7:30 a.m., as the vessel began to move away from the dock, the Eastland rolled completely onto its side. The disaster was over in less than 2 minutes. The witnesses on the wharf saw it happen in slow motion and all at once. Warehouse workers along the Chicago River shouted first, "Look out! She's tipping!" The warning came too late to mean anything. Some passengers on the upper decks jumped to the dock as the gap widened. Others froze, unable to process what was happening. A ship doesn't capsize while tied up. A ship doesn't roll over in 20 feet of water, 19 feet from shore. The Eastland rolled. The world turned sideways for 2,500 people. Passengers on the port side, the river side, fell into the Chicago River. Passengers on the starboard side found themselves suddenly standing on what had been a vertical wall. Passengers below decks experienced something worse. The floor became a wall, the wall became a ceiling, and water rushed in through portholes that were now below the waterline. The ship came to rest on the river bottom, with its starboard side exposed above the surface. The port side was submerged in 20 feet of murky water. The vessel had rotated approximately 90 degrees in roughly 120 seconds. People who had been standing on the upper decks simply walked across the exposed hull to safety, their feet never getting wet. E.W. Sladke, the latecomer who had leapt aboard at 7:18 a.m., was one of them. So was Captain Peterson. They climbed over the starboard railing and stepped onto what was now the highest point of the vessel. Those below decks had no such option. The water in the Chicago River was not clean. It was industrial water, murky with sediment and waste. Visibility was measured in inches. The interior of the capsized ship was completely dark. Passengers trapped inside couldn't see the water rising, couldn't orient themselves to find exits, couldn't tell which way was up. Many died from suffocation before they drowned. Bodies pressed against bodies in the darkness. Furniture slid and tumbled, pianos, bookcases, tables. In some compartments, people were crushed by the shifting weight. In others, they were pinned beneath debris as water filled the spaces around them. Coroner's physician Joseph Springer later examined most of the bodies as they were brought ashore. He determined cause of death by pinching the throat of each victim with his fingers. The majority had suffocated, not drowned. They had run out of air in pockets of the ship before the water reached them. Divers who entered the submerged sections of the hull heard tapping and faint cries. Passengers were alive inside, trapped in air pockets, unable to escape through the twisted corridors and blocked passageways. The tapping was Morse code signals beaten against the hull with fists and shoes. Rescue workers called for acetylene torches. The plan was to cut 8 holes in the steamer's side to reach the trapped passengers. Captain Peterson, standing on the exposed hull, disapproved of welders cutting into his ship. One witness later recalled the captain's protest that they were ruining his ship. The ice welders ignored him and began cutting. 40 people were pulled alive through the torch-cut holes. The rest of those who survived had already escaped, the ones who had been on the upper decks, the ones who could swim, the ones who happened to be near an exit when the ship rolled. Nearby boats scrambled to the scene. The Theodore Roosevelt, the second ship scheduled for the picnic, was converted into a temporary morgue. Bodies pulled from the Eastland by divers and firemen were laid along the Roosevelt's decks until there was no more room. Then the Reed Murdoch warehouse on the riverfront was opened to receive the dead. A continuous line of stretcher-bearers formed. Over the side of the Eastland, across the deck of the Kenosha, another vessel docked nearby, along the narrow dock, up the stairs to street level. Once the system was organized, bodies were brought out at a rate of 2 per minute. The Chicago Police Department arrived. The Fire Department arrived. The newly formed Coast Guard Station, Old Chicago Station, responded to what would become the modern Coast Guard's first major rescue operation. Petty Officer First Class William E. Preston and 7 surfmen joined hundreds of others in the recovery efforts. Photographers documented everything: the Chicago Examiner, the Chicago Tribune, newspapers across the country. They all sent photographers. The images that resulted are almost impossible to process. Women in white dresses standing on the side of a capsized ship. Men in suits waist-deep in the river pulling bodies from portholes. A wall of onlookers watching from the wharf, their faces blank with shock. By afternoon, the Reed Murdoch warehouse was full. The 2nd Regiment Armory was opened as an additional morgue. Families began arriving to identify bodies. The identification process was chaotic. Some bodies were badly crushed or disfigured. Some had no identification. Some families found multiple members dead: mothers and children, fathers and sons, entire households wiped out. Of the 844 who died, 220 were employees of Western Electric's Hawthorne Works. Many were Czech immigrants who had settled in Cicero. Whole sections of the Czech community mourned together. 22 complete families were destroyed. The disaster left 175 women as widows, 3 of them pregnant. 84 men became widowers. Newspapers called it Chicago's deadliest day. The death toll exceeded the official count from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 by a factor of 7. The Eastland remained on its side in the river, a grotesque monument to whatever had just happened. Investigators, journalists, company officials, and city authorities all descended on the scene within hours, each asking the same question in different ways. How does a ship capsize while docked? The answer would take years to construct and would never fully satisfy anyone. The salvage began immediately, even while bodies were still being recovered. The Eastland couldn't remain on its side in the Chicago River indefinitely. The vessel blocked navigation. It was a public health hazard. Most pressingly, there were still bodies inside. The ship had to be raised. The salvage tug Favorite took charge of operations. Divers worked in the murky water, securing chains and cables around the hull. The technical challenge was substantial: how to right a 1,961-ton vessel lying on its side in a narrow river without causing further damage or releasing more bodies into the water. The work took 3 weeks. On August 14, 1915, the Eastland was raised and righted. The hull was pumped dry. The final bodies were removed. The ship that had killed 844 people was now floating upright again, as if nothing had happened. Here are the numbers that quantify what happened. 844 dead in 20 feet of water. 2,573 passengers and crew aboard a vessel certified for 2,500. The ship capsized in approximately 2 minutes. 1,656 survived. 11 lifeboats were installed where 6 had been designed, adding thousands of pounds to the upper decks. The vessel's metacentric height, its measure of stability, had been reduced to 4 inches by modifications made before July 24th. 0 stability tests were conducted after the concrete and lifeboat additions. The disaster occurred 19 feet from the wharf. Bodies were recovered at a rate of 2 per minute once the system was organized. 22 complete families were erased. The vessel was towed to a different location and secured. It sat there while lawyers argued over who owned what was left, who owed what to whom, and who bore responsibility for the disaster. Multiple investigations launched simultaneously. The coroner's jury began hearings on July 24th, the same day as the disaster, and continued through July 29th. A federal grand jury was convened. The U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service opened an inquiry. The local prosecutors prepared criminal charges. The investigations quickly revealed what many already suspected. The Eastland had been a dangerous vessel for years, and numerous people had known it. The grand jury indicted the president and 3 other officers of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company for manslaughter. Captain Harry Peterson and Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson were charged with criminal carelessness. The indictment stated the disaster was caused by conditions of instability resulting from overloading of passengers, mishandling of water ballast, and the ship's inherent design flaws. But someone made a decision. The original charges, criminal negligence and manslaughter, were changed by the presiding judge to a different charge: conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. This change was significant. Negligence could be proven with documentation of the ship's history, the known stability problems, the deferred maintenance. Conspiracy required proof that the defendants had actively plotted together to operate a vessel they knew to be unsafe. It required intent, coordination, premeditation. No one had conspired. The owners had been negligent, certainly. They had deferred repairs, ignored warnings, prioritized profit over safety. But conspiracy? There was no evidence of any coordinated plot. Clarence Darrow was hired to defend Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson. Darrow was already a national figure by 1915, famous for defending labor unions, anarchists, and controversial clients. He had represented Eugene Debs in the Pullman strike case. He had defended numerous murder cases. His courtroom oratory was legendary. He could speak for hours without notes, moving judges and juries to tears or rage. By 1915, Darrow was in what one historian called the valley of his career. He had recently been accused of bribing jurors in another case. His reputation had been damaged. But he was still Clarence Darrow, and when he took Erickson's case, the trial became national news. Darrow's defense strategy was creative. He argued that the ship must have been resting on an underwater obstruction that caused the capsize. During the federal trial, this theory was proven false. There was no obstruction. The river bottom had been surveyed. The ship had simply rolled over due to instability. The defense attorney's clients pointed fingers at each other. The owners claimed they didn't know about the ship's problems when they purchased it. The inspectors claimed they had inspected properly. The crew claimed they had followed standard procedures. Everyone blamed someone else. The only person who told the complete truth was Erickson, Darrow's client. He admitted he had opened ballast tanks, that the system had responded slowly, that he couldn't correct the list in time. He didn't claim the ship was resting on an obstruction. He simply described what had happened. In February 1916, a federal judge found all defendants not guilty of conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. The judge ruled that the disaster was an accident. No one would face criminal charges. The verdict was technically correct under the narrowed charge. There had been no conspiracy, but the verdict also meant no one was held criminally responsible for operating a vessel that had nearly capsized multiple times before, that had documented stability problems, that had been scheduled for repairs that were deferred until after the sailing season. Joseph Erickson died of heart failure in April 1919 at age 34, before he could face any potential state criminal charges. He had become, in the words of one historian who analyzed thousands of pages of documents, a convenient fall guy. Civil litigation began immediately and would drag on for 20 years. The legal structure was Byzantine. Under maritime law, the ship owner's liability was limited to the value of the salvaged vessel. The Eastland wreck was valued at approximately $50,000. From that amount, the cost of raising the ship, approximately $35,000, had to be subtracted. Then, the cost of coal still aboard. Then claims from the Picnic Concession Company. All creditors had to be paid first. After all deductions, there was almost nothing left for the victims' families. Western Electric Company and the Red Cross provided most of the actual assistance. The company contributed $100,000 to relief efforts. The Red Cross, local charities, and civic leaders established the Eastland Disaster Relief Fund, which raised approximately $400,000 through donations from individuals, businesses, unions, and community groups. The fund provided assistance for funeral costs, immediate living expenses, and support for widows, orphans, and injured survivors. but families were often required to sign waivers releasing Western Electric from future liability in exchange for the company's payments. The civil trial attempting to assign legal liability continued through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The final lawsuit wasn't decided until 1935, 20 years after the disaster. By then, most of the key witnesses were dead. Erickson was dead. Many survivors had moved away. Memories had faded. Documents had been lost or destroyed. The court eventually determined that the chief engineer was to blame for not properly maintaining the ballast system. This was the only charge that stuck in any legal proceeding. Erickson, conveniently dead and unable to defend himself, bore the final legal responsibility. The owners avoided any finding of negligence. The ship had passed inspections. It had been certified as seaworthy. It was in legal compliance with federal safety regulations. Therefore, the owners could not be held liable. No amount of documentation about prior near capsizings, no testimony about deferred repairs, no evidence of known instability changed this conclusion. The ship had passed inspection. That was sufficient. The families of the 844 dead received little or nothing from the legal system. In November 1917, 2 years after the disaster, 2 years after 844 people died, the United States Navy purchased the Eastland from the Central Trust Company of Illinois. The vessel that had capsized while docked, that had killed more people than the Titanic, that had been deemed too unstable to operate safely as a passenger ship, was about to become a warship. America had entered World War I in April 1917. The Navy needed vessels quickly. The Great Lakes offered a training ground far from German U-boats. The Eastland, despite its history, was available, cheap, and could be converted. On February 20, 1918, the vessel was renamed USS Wilmette. The conversion work was extensive. The high superstructure that had contributed to the top-heavy design was cut down. The bow was removed so the ship could fit through the Welland Canal for potential service in the Atlantic. A false bow was fitted so the vessel could travel under its own steam to Boston. The interior was gutted and reconfigured. Gun mounts were installed. The ship was being transformed from a passenger excursion steamer into a gunboat. Then, on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. World War I ended. The Wilmette never saw combat. Instead, the ship found a new purpose: training. The USS Wilmette was commissioned on September 20, 1918, under Captain William B. Wells. She was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Station and assigned to train naval reservists. The vessel that had been too unstable for civilian passengers was now deemed acceptable for training sailors. The ship made voyages along the shores of the Great Lakes, carrying trainees from the naval station. She sailed under different circumstances than before, with a military crew trained in ballast management, with reduced upper structure, with constant monitoring of stability. The modifications had apparently addressed some of the original design flaws. The Wilmette listed but didn't capsize. In June 1921, journalist Ernie Pyle served aboard the Wilmette during a 3-week Naval Reserve training cruise. Years later, he recalled the experience in one of his newspaper columns. He noted that the ship constantly shied to the right. The instability hadn't been eliminated. It had been managed. On June 7, 1921, the USS Wilmette left her dock at the end of Randolph Street in Chicago and steamed out into Lake Michigan on a peculiar mission. She was tasked with sinking UC-97, a German U-boat that had been surrendered to the United States after World War I. The submarine had been towed into Lake Michigan by the USS Hawk. The Navy wanted to conduct a live-fire exercise to demonstrate what American guns could do to a submarine and to give gunners practical experience. The event was designed as both training and spectacle. 2 gunner's mates were selected for the honor of firing on the U-boat. Gunner's mate J.O. Sabin had fired the first American shell in World War I. Gunner's mate A.F. Anderson had fired the first American torpedo in the war. Together, aboard the Wilmette, they fired 13 shells. 10 of them hit. The UC-97 sank in 10 minutes. The ship that had killed 844 people had now successfully destroyed a German submarine. For the remainder of her career, 25 years in total, the Wilmette served as a training vessel. She carried thousands of Midwestern farm boys and factory workers through their introduction to military service. She trained sailors for the 9th, 10th, and 11th Naval Districts. She steamed approximately 150,000 miles on the Great Lakes without a major incident. In August 1943, during World War II, the Wilmette was chosen for a secret mission. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Admiral William D. Leahy, James F. Burns, and Harry Hopkins boarded the vessel for a 10-day fishing vacation in McGregor and Whitefish Bays on Lake Huron. They used the trip to plot war strategies away from Washington. The government chose the Wilmette specifically because of her comfortable cabins, holdovers from the Eastland days. The ship that had once carried Chicago factory workers to a company picnic now carried the President of the United States on a wartime retreat. The irony was apparently lost on the Navy planners, or perhaps deemed irrelevant. The cabins were comfortable. That was what mattered. The Wilmette was placed out of commission in service on February 15, 1940. Given hull designation 929 on February 17, 1941, she resumed training duty at Chicago on March 30, 1942. Her new mission, preparing armed guard crews for duty manning guns on armed merchantmen. These crews would protect transatlantic shipping from German U-boats, the same threat that had driven the expansion of the Navy's training program. On April 9, 1945, she was returned to full commission for a brief interval. World War II in Europe ended the following month. The need for Great Lakes training vessels declined rapidly. The USS Wilmette was decommissioned on November 28, 1945. Her name was deleted from the Navy list on December 19, 1945. In 1946, the government offered the ship for sale. No buyers emerged immediately. Who wanted a 30-year-old training vessel with a history like the Wilmette's? On October 31, 1946, the Hyman Michaels Company purchased the USS Wilmette for scrap. The sale price was approximately $2,500, roughly the cost of recovering 3 bodies from the Chicago River in 1915, adjusted for inflation. The ship was scrapped in 1947. The steel was melted down, repurposed, dispersed. The vessel that had lived 2 complete lives, first as the Eastland, then as the Wilmette, ceased to exist as a physical object. But the Eastland disaster had already begun to fade from public memory even before the ship was scrapped. World War I had dominated headlines starting in 1917. By the 1920s, America was focused on prohibition, jazz, economic boom. By the 1930s, the Depression occupied everyone's attention. By the 1940s, World War II overshadowed all previous catastrophes. The Eastland disaster, which had killed more people than the Titanic, which had been Chicago's deadliest day, was forgotten by most Americans outside the families directly affected. The victims were primarily working-class immigrants. They didn't have powerful advocates. Their deaths didn't change maritime law. The Seamen's Act, the law that had arguably contributed to the disaster, remained in effect. No significant reforms were implemented specifically because of the Eastland. The disaster didn't fit easily into any narrative framework. It wasn't a story of heroic rescue like some shipwrecks. It wasn't a tale of clear villainy. No captain had steered into an iceberg. No company had explicitly prioritized profits over safety in an obvious way. It was a story of accumulated negligence, deferred maintenance, conflicting regulations, and systemic failure. Those stories don't inspire memorials or generate sustained public interest. In 1989, a marker commemorating the disaster was dedicated along the Chicago River. On April 26, 2000, the marker was reported stolen. A replacement was installed and dedicated on July 24, 2003, 88 years after the disaster. As of 2015, the centennial of the disaster, plans existed for a permanent outdoor exhibit called At the River's Edge along the Chicago Riverwalk adjacent to the site. The exhibit would consist of panels with text and images. It would tell the story of what happened on July 24, 1915, when a ship capsized in 20 feet of water, 19 feet from shore, and killed 844 people. The ship itself is gone. The bodies are buried, many at Bohemian National Cemetery, where a memorial was dedicated on July 12, 2015. The physical evidence has been melted, scattered, lost to time. What remains is the question the disaster poses. Was this a failure of design, or a failure of law, or a failure of oversight, or a failure of profit-driven decision-making, or all of these simultaneously? The Eastland passed every inspection. The ship was in legal compliance with federal safety regulations. No criminal conspiracy existed. No individual actor bore sole responsibility. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to function, and 844 people died anyway. Josephine Polifka wore a white summer dress when she and her sisters walked toward the docks on July 24, 1915. The Polifka family lived in Cicero, worked at the Hawthorne Works, and looked forward to the annual picnic like most of their neighbors. The Czech community in Cicero was tightly knit. Families knew each other, worked together, attended the same churches, celebrated the same holidays. The Western Electric picnic was one of the few days when the factory stopped and families could simply be families. Josephine and her sisters boarded the Eastland. The exact details of what happened to them in the next hour are lost. What's documented? The Polifka family lost multiple members that day. They were among the 220 Hawthorne Works employees who died in the disaster. Of the 844 who died, 220 were from a single factory in a single town. This concentration of loss created a specific kind of devastation. Entire neighborhoods mourned simultaneously. The Czech community in Cicero, which had provided much of the Hawthorne workforce, was particularly devastated. Funerals were held for days. Churches couldn't accommodate all the services. The 2nd Regiment Armory, which had served as a temporary morgue, became a site of collective grief. 22 complete families were destroyed, every member dead. No one left to carry the name, maintain the household, remember the private jokes and shared histories that define a family. The numbers tell part of the story. 175 women became widows, 3 of them pregnant. 84 men became widowers. Children became orphans. Parents buried their children. The demographic impact on Cicero was severe enough that some streets had multiple households affected, multiple homes where no one came back from the picnic. The Western Electric Company responded quickly with financial assistance, but the money came with strings attached. Families were often required to sign waivers releasing the company from future liability in exchange for immediate payments to cover funeral costs and living expenses. The families had no leverage. They needed the money immediately. They signed. The Eastland Disaster Relief Fund, managed by the Red Cross with oversight from civic leaders, distributed approximately $400,000 to victims' families and survivors. The fund was raised through donations from individuals, businesses, unions, and community groups. The distribution was managed by a board of trustees who determined eligibility and payment amounts. Some families received substantial assistance. Others received little. The criteria for distribution were not always clear. The process was chaotic in the immediate aftermath. So many dead, so many families in need, so few established procedures for handling a disaster of this scale. The long-term economic impact on the families was devastating. Many of the dead were primary breadwinners. The loss of income meant widows and children had to find work immediately, often taking whatever jobs were available. Child labor laws in 1915 were minimal. Children as young as 12 or 13 went to work in factories to help support their families. Some widows remarried quickly out of economic necessity. Others struggled alone. The social safety net in 1915 was virtually non-existent. There was no Social Security, no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation system that adequately covered this type of disaster. Families relied on churches, ethnic mutual aid societies, and extended family networks to survive. The psychological impact was less documented, but equally severe. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized as a diagnosis for decades, but the symptoms were present. Survivors reported nightmares, inability to go near water, panic attacks when in enclosed spaces. Some survivors never spoke about the disaster again. Others couldn't stop talking about it. Libby Hruby of Cicero was one of the last remaining survivors when she was interviewed decades later. She described the underwater chaos, the darkness, the confusion, the bodies pressing against her the moment she thought she would die. She also described the silence that followed in the Czech community. People didn't want to talk about it. The grief was too raw, the loss too complete. The disaster disrupted the social fabric of Cicero in ways that persisted for generations. Families that had lost members carried that loss forward. Children who survived grew up with the knowledge that their siblings or parents had died in the river. The trauma was inherited. Some families left Cicero entirely. The memories were too painful. Others stayed but avoided anything connected to Western Electric. The company continued to operate the Hawthorne Works, and employment there remained the primary economic option for many Cicero residents. But some families refused to work there, refused to participate in company events, refused to trust an institution that had chartered the ship that killed their loved ones. The question of blame complicated the grieving process. Who were the families supposed to be angry at? The ship's owners, who had deferred maintenance? The federal inspectors, who had certified the vessel as seaworthy? The engineers, who had designed a fundamentally unstable ship? The legislators, who had mandated lifeboats without considering stability? Western Electric, who had chartered the vessel? The legal system provided no clear answer. No one was held criminally responsible. The civil litigation dragged on for 20 years and provided almost no compensation. The families were left with their grief and their anger and no satisfactory target for either. Some families found solace in religion. Churches offered the only framework available for making sense of senseless death. Funeral services emphasized God's will, the promise of reunion in heaven, the consolation of faith. These narratives helped some people. Others found them hollow. The Czech community created informal memorials, gatherings on the anniversary, shared meals, moments of silence. But these observances faded over time. Younger generations didn't have direct memories of the disaster. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Eastland was becoming history rather than lived experience. By the 1960s and 1970s, when the Hawthorne Works was still operating at peak capacity, many employees had no knowledge that their factory had been at the center of Chicago's deadliest disaster. The institutional memory had been lost or deliberately forgotten. When the Hawthorne Works closed in 1983, permanently after 78 years of operation, the connection between the factory and the disaster was noted in some historical accounts, but not emphasized. The factory had contributed to American industrial history, to quality management research, to telecommunications infrastructure. The Eastland disaster was a footnote. The site of the Hawthorne Works is now a shopping center. One original tower remains at the corner of 22nd Street and Cicero Avenue. The tower is preserved as a historical marker, but most shoppers don't know what it marks. In 2015, for the centennial of the disaster, descendants of victims gathered at the Bohemian National Cemetery for a memorial service. Some were grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the dead. They had grown up with family stories about the Eastland, about relatives they never met, about the day the ship rolled over. The memorial included the names of the 844 dead. Reading the names aloud took over an hour. Some names had multiple family members listed, fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, entire households erased in 2 minutes. The descendants discussed their family histories. Some had researched extensively, tracking down newspaper accounts and official records. Others had only fragments, a name, a date, a story passed down through generations that might or might not be accurate. The disaster had created a specific kind of family memory, vivid in its emotional impact, often unclear in its details. What united them was the absence. The people who weren't there at family gatherings, the photographs that were never taken, the generations that didn't exist because someone died on July 24, 1915. The disaster had created silences in family trees, gaps in the genealogical record that could never be filled. The families didn't receive justice in any conventional sense. They received some money, some sympathy, and the eventual forgetting that time brings to all tragedies. Their loved ones became statistics, part of the 844, part of Chicago's deadliest day, part of a historical event that most Americans have never heard of. On July 23, 1915, one day before the disaster, federal inspectors certified the SS Eastland as seaworthy. The inspection was conducted according to established procedures. The inspectors examined the vessel's hull, machinery, safety equipment, and crew qualifications. They verified that the ship carried sufficient lifeboats and life-saving apparatus as required by the newly enacted Seamen's Act. They confirmed the vessel was in compliance with all applicable federal regulations. The ship passed. The inspection report made no mention of the Eastland's documented history of instability. It made no mention of the near capsizings in 1904, 1906, and 1912. It made no mention of the crew mutiny in 1903 over safety concerns. It made no mention of the multiple ownership transfers, the deferred maintenance, or the naval architect reports recommending structural modifications. The inspection focused on what the ship was at that moment, not what it had been or what it might become under certain conditions. This approach was standard practice for the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service. Inspectors evaluated vessels based on current condition and compliance with regulations. They were not tasked with investigating a ship's operational history or predicting future performance under various load conditions. The inspectors tested the Eastland while underway. The vessel performed adequately when moving through the water. The ship's documented instability problems occurred primarily during loading and unloading when stationary or at low speed. The inspection didn't specifically test for stability during these critical phases. The metacentric height, the technical measurement of a vessel's stability, was not part of the standard inspection protocol. Inspectors were not required to calculate or verify this figure. They relied on the ship's certification documents and the vessel's performance during the inspection voyage. The addition of lifeboats mandated by the Seamen's Act had added significant weight to the upper decks. The concrete laid to shore up rotting wood had added more weight. Neither modification triggered a requirement for stability recalculation. The law required lifeboats. The ship had lifeboats. Inspection complete. The inspectors were not incompetent. They were following established procedures that had been developed over decades of maritime commerce. Those procedures were designed to verify compliance with regulations, not to evaluate the fundamental soundness of a vessel's design or to predict catastrophic failure. The regulatory framework contained a logical gap. Regulations required safety equipment but didn't require verification that the safety equipment itself didn't create new hazards. More lifeboats meant more safety according to the regulatory logic. The possibility that more lifeboats could make a top-heavy vessel dangerously unstable wasn't accounted for in the inspection protocol. After the disaster, the steamboat inspection service came under intense scrutiny. How had an unsafe vessel been certified as seaworthy? How had inspectors missed such obvious problems? The answer was uncomfortable. The inspectors hadn't missed anything according to their mandate. The ship was in compliance. The regulations had been followed. The system had functioned exactly as designed. The problem wasn't inspector negligence. The problem was that the inspection system evaluated compliance rather than safety. These aren't always the same thing. George Hilton, the transportation historian who later analyzed thousands of pages of documents related to the disaster, concluded that blame rested not with individual inspectors, but with a regulatory system that couldn't account for complex interactions between ship design, load distribution, ballast management, and added safety equipment. The Seamen's Act had been passed with the best intentions to prevent another Titanic, to ensure that every passenger had access to a lifeboat. But the law didn't require ships to be redesigned or recertified when adding the mandated safety equipment. It assumed that existing vessels could accommodate the additional weight without creating new risks. For most ships, this assumption was correct. For the Eastland, it was fatal. Congressional testimony before the Seamen's Act was passed included warnings about this exact scenario. The general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company had explicitly stated that adding lifeboats posed risks to certain Great Lakes vessels with shallow drafts and high centers of gravity. His concerns were noted and set aside. The political pressure to pass comprehensive lifeboat requirements was too strong. After the Eastland disaster, the Steamboat Inspection Service implemented new protocols. Stability assessments became mandatory for structural modifications. Load capacity certifications required more rigorous testing. Metacentric height calculations were integrated into approval processes for top deck additions. These reforms came too late for the 844 who died, but they addressed the regulatory gap that had allowed the Eastland to operate legally while being fundamentally unsafe. The inspectors who certified the Eastland on July 23, 1915, were not prosecuted or professionally sanctioned. They had followed procedures. The disaster revealed that the procedures were inadequate, but individual inspectors couldn't be held responsible for systemic regulatory failure. This outcome frustrated families of victims who wanted someone to be held accountable. The owners claimed they relied on the inspector's certification. The inspectors claimed they followed regulations. The legislators who wrote the regulations claimed they were responding to public demand for safety improvements after the Titanic. Everyone had an explanation. No one had responsibility. The question of what the inspectors should have seen requires asking what they were trained to look for and what authority they had to act on observations outside their official mandate. If an inspector noticed a ship listed during loading but performed adequately when underway, what was the appropriate response? The regulations didn't provide clear guidance. The inspection protocols didn't include procedures for evaluating transient instability during passenger boarding. Some historical accounts suggest the inspectors were captured by industry interests, that they were too friendly with ship owners, that they prioritized commerce over safety. The evidence for this is ambiguous. The Steamboat Inspection Service had limited resources, large territories to cover, and pressure to keep maritime commerce moving. Inspectors who were too strict risked complaints from shipping companies. Inspectors who were too lenient risked disasters. The Eastland put inspectors in an impossible position. How could they fail a vessel that was in technical compliance with all regulations, that had been operating for 12 years, that had passed previous inspections, that was owned by a legitimate company? The answer apparently was that they couldn't, not under the existing system. The system would need to change first, but systems change slowly, and usually only after disasters prove that change is necessary. The Eastland disaster was that proof. The reforms that followed might have prevented another Eastland. They didn't bring back the dead or provide justice to the families. They simply made the regulatory framework marginally better at catching dangerous vessels before they killed people. One day, too late, as usual. Some survivors reported seeing figures in the water that shouldn't have been there. In the immediate chaos of the capsizing, witnesses described passengers who appeared to be standing on the water's surface, or walking through the river as if it were solid ground. These accounts were given in the first hours after the disaster, when shock and trauma were at their peak. Later, the same witnesses often recanted or qualified their statements, attributing the visions to panic, to the murky water creating optical illusions, to the mind's attempt to process the impossible. The Chicago River in 1915 was heavily polluted. Visibility in the water was measured in inches. Bodies floating just below the surface could appear to be standing or walking. The refraction of light through murky water can create strange visual effects. The brain, confronted with overwhelming horror, sometimes fills in gaps with patterns that make sense, even if those patterns involve the supernatural. But the reports persisted, not just from traumatized survivors, but from rescue workers, from people on the shore, from those who arrived after the initial capsizing. One rescue worker described pulling a woman from the water who insisted her daughter was right there, pointing to an empty space in the river. The woman was certain her daughter was standing in the water, waving. Divers searched the area and found a body pinned beneath debris, approximately where the woman had been pointing. The daughter had been dead for at least 30 minutes by the time they recovered her. A photographer capturing images of the disaster reported feeling an intense cold while standing on the dock, despite the July temperature. He described it as the cold of winter in the middle of summer, localized to the area immediately adjacent to the capsized vessel. Other witnesses on the dock that day reported normal temperatures. The photographer couldn't explain the sensation except to say it felt like standing in a walk-in freezer. These accounts are difficult to evaluate. Post-traumatic stress can create vivid sensory experiences that feel entirely real. Grief can manifest as hallucinations. Seeing or hearing the deceased is a common response to sudden loss. The human mind is remarkably skilled at creating meaning from chaos, pattern from randomness, presence from absence. The alternative explanation that something genuinely paranormal occurred in the Chicago River on July 24, 1915, requires accepting that consciousness persists after death, that traumatic deaths create psychic disturbances, that the boundary between living and dead is permeable under certain conditions. These claims have never been scientifically verified. What's documented, multiple witnesses reported experiences they couldn't explain through ordinary means. Some maintained their accounts for decades. Others dismissed their own experiences as trauma-induced delusions. The Reed Murdoch warehouse, which served as a temporary morgue, became the site of later ghost stories. Workers in the building reported hearing tapping sounds from empty rooms, reminiscent of the tapping heard from inside the capsized ship. Night watchmen reported feeling presences, seeing shadows move where no one was present, hearing voices in languages they didn't understand. These reports are second-hand, passed down through warehouse workers and their families. They can't be verified. They may be urban legends that grew around a site associated with mass death, stories that serve a psychological need rather than reflecting actual events. The 2nd Regiment Armory, which served as the main morgue, was the site of similar stories. Veterans who trained there in later years reported unusual cold spots, unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched. Again, these reports are anecdotal and unverifiable. In the 1990s, paranormal investigators visited sites associated with the disaster. They recorded electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature anomalies, and audio recordings that some interpreted as voices. Skeptics pointed out that urban environments produce electromagnetic interference constantly, that old buildings have variable temperatures, that the human tendency to hear patterns in random noise, pareidolia, explains most spirit voices captured on audio recordings. The evidence for haunting is ambiguous at best. What's not ambiguous? The disaster created a psychological wound in Chicago that persisted for generations. The site of the capsizing remained emotionally charged for people connected to the event. Walking past the location on the Chicago River could trigger powerful emotional responses in survivors and family members of victims, even decades later. Whether this emotional residue constitutes evidence of paranormal activity depends on one's definition of paranormal. If ghosts are understood as persistent emotional imprints rather than conscious entities, then yes, the Eastland disaster created ghosts. If ghosts require the survival of individual consciousness after death, the evidence is insufficient. Some family members of victims reported dreams in which the deceased appeared to provide comfort or closure. These dreams were often vivid and emotionally powerful. Dream researchers would classify these as grief dreams, the psyche's attempt to process loss and maintain connection with the deceased. They serve an important psychological function regardless of whether they reflect actual contact with the dead. The Bohemian National Cemetery, where many victims are buried, has been the subject of paranormal investigation. Researchers report unusual activity near the Eastland Memorial. The standard explanations apply. Cemeteries at night are creepy. Humans are primed to perceive threat in darkness. Any ambiguous stimulus will be interpreted through the lens of expectation. One investigator reported capturing a photograph near the memorial that showed an unexplained figure in early 20th century clothing. Analysis of the photograph revealed it was likely a double exposure or a person in period costume who happened to be visiting the cemetery. The investigator maintained the image was genuine. Skeptics remained unconvinced. The Disney Channel series So Weird incorporated the Eastland disaster into its 1999 series premiere. The episode featured a teenage paranormal enthusiast encountering the ghost of a boy who drowned in the disaster. This fictional treatment introduced the Eastland story to a new generation, but also blurred the line between historical event and supernatural narrative. The question of whether the disaster site is haunted ultimately can't be answered definitively. What can be stated? People reported experiences they interpreted as paranormal. Those experiences were real in the sense that people genuinely perceived them. Whether the experiences reflect objective supernatural phenomena or subjective psychological responses to trauma and grief is a matter of interpretation. The disaster created conditions ripe for ghost stories: sudden mass death, unfinished business, traumatic circumstances, grief-stricken survivors seeking connection with the lost. Ghost stories serve functions. They keep memory alive. They provide frameworks for processing grief. They suggest that death isn't the final word. Whether the ghosts are real or metaphorical, they persist. The dead of the Eastland remain present in Chicago's collective memory, in family histories, in the stories told about the disaster. They haunt the city not necessarily as conscious spirits, but as absences that can never be filled, as questions that can never be fully answered, as wounds that never completely heal. The river flows past the site of the disaster every day. The water is cleaner now than it was in 1915. The ghosts, if they exist, swim in cleaner water. They tap on hulls that are no longer there. They wait for rescue that came too late. Or perhaps there are no ghosts at all. Perhaps there are only the living carrying the weight of the dead, creating stories to make sense of senseless loss, seeing patterns in the murky water of history. The Chicago River moves past the site every day, carrying runoff and commerce, and the occasional tour boat narrating architectural history to passengers who don't know what happened here. The water is cleaner now. Federal regulations passed decades after the Eastland require industrial waste treatment, mandate pollution controls, limit the discharge of contaminants. The river that was murky and toxic in 1915 is now clear enough to see several feet down. Fish have returned. Kayakers paddle through downtown Chicago on summer weekends. The exact spot where the Eastland capsized is now part of the Chicago Riverwalk, a public promenade with restaurants, boat launches, and recreational spaces. Tourists sit on benches eating lunch, unaware they're occupying the site of 844 deaths. The city has built something pleasant where something terrible happened. This is what cities do. They layer present over past, function over memory, optimism over tragedy. A small memorial plaque was installed in 1989, stolen in 2000, replaced in 2003. It sits along the Riverwalk, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The plaque lists basic facts: date, death toll, location. It doesn't explain how a ship capsizes in 20 feet of water. It doesn't detail the legal proceedings that provided no justice. It doesn't name the 844 dead. That would require a much larger memorial. Plans for a more substantial memorial, at the river's edge, have existed since at least 2015. The proposed exhibit would include panels with text and images, historical context, perhaps interactive elements. As of the centennial, funding and approval remained uncertain. Memory competes with other priorities. Memorials cost money. The dead have been dead for over a century. At Bohemian National Cemetery, the memorial dedicated in 2015 lists all 844 names. Reading them takes over an hour. Some names appear multiple times: Novak, Kovarik, Svoboda, common Czech surnames that indicate multiple family members lost. The memorial exists because descendants insisted on it, because the Czech community in Chicago maintained the memory even as the broader city forgot. The Hawthorne Works is gone. The factory that employed 45,000 workers at its peak, that drove the economy of Cicero for nearly 8 decades, was demolished in 1994. A shopping center occupies the site now: retail stores, chain restaurants, parking lots. One tower remains as a historical marker. Most shoppers don't know what it marks or why it was preserved. Western Electric dissolved into AT&T Technologies after the 1984 Bell System breakup. The company that had chartered the Eastland no longer exists as a distinct entity. The institutional knowledge dispersed with the workforce. The connections between past and present corporate entities are technical and legal, not meaningful. The St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company went bankrupt in the aftermath of the disaster. The company's assets were liquidated. The owners moved on to other ventures or retired. None faced criminal penalties. None paid significant civil damages. Captain Harry Peterson continued working as a ship's captain after the disaster. He was not professionally sanctioned. He testified at the various trials and inquiries, maintained that he had followed standard procedures, and died decades later without ever accepting responsibility for the capsizing. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson died in 1919 before the civil litigation concluded. He became the final scapegoat, blamed in civil court for mismanaging the ballast system, conveniently dead and unable to defend himself. His family received no compensation for his service or his posthumous blame. Clarence Darrow went on to greater fame with the Leopold and Loeb case and the Scopes trial. He never mentioned the Eastland in his autobiography. The case had been early in his career, a loss by association, even though his client was acquitted, not memorable enough to warrant inclusion in the story he told about himself. The reforms that followed the disaster, mandatory stability assessments, stricter inspection protocols, metacentric height calculations, prevented some future catastrophes. Ships were designed more carefully. Regulations accounted for interactions between safety equipment and structural stability. The lessons learned from the Eastland saved lives that were never counted, because disasters that didn't happen aren't recorded. But the reforms came too late for the 844. This is always how it works. The disaster reveals the flaw. The system adapts. The next group is safer. The previous group remains dead. Progress is built on corpses, regulation on catastrophe, safety on suffering. The Seamen's Act remained law. The requirement for sufficient lifeboats persisted, modified by the additional requirement that adding safety equipment couldn't compromise vessel stability. The law that arguably contributed to the Eastland disaster was fixed around the edges, but not fundamentally reconsidered. The Titanic still haunted lawmakers more than the Eastland ever would. By the centennial in 2015, most Americans had never heard of the Eastland disaster. It didn't appear in history textbooks. It wasn't taught in schools. It remained known primarily within families directly affected and among Great Lakes maritime historians. The disaster that killed more people than the Titanic, that was Chicago's deadliest day, that exposed fundamental flaws in maritime regulation, had been largely forgotten. Several factors explain the forgetting. World War I dominated headlines within 2 years of the disaster. The victims were primarily working-class immigrants without powerful advocates. The legal proceedings produced no satisfying villain or clear narrative of justice. The disaster didn't fit neatly into existing story frameworks. It was complicated in ways that resist simple retelling. The ship itself, converted to the USS Wilmette, used as a training vessel for 27 years, scrapped in 1947, had a longer functional life than most vessels of its era. The hull that had killed 844 people went on to serve the nation, train thousands of sailors, transport a president during wartime, sink a German submarine. The ship's second life eclipsed its first in duration, if not in significance. This creates a strange moral calculus. Can a ship that killed hundreds be redeemed through subsequent service? Can an object bear moral weight, or is morality solely a property of the humans who designed, built, operated, regulated, and used the vessel? The Eastland was a poorly designed ship operated by negligent owners under inadequate regulations with insufficient oversight. The disaster was overdetermined, multiple causes, multiple failures, multiple missed opportunities to prevent catastrophe. Fixing any single factor might have prevented the capsizing. Fixing all the factors was apparently impossible within the economic and regulatory constraints of 1915. The families of the 844 dead never received justice in any conventional sense. They received some money, some sympathy, and the slow erosion of grief that time provides. Their loved ones became statistics. Their loss became history. Their anger became resignation. The river still flows. The city continues. The site of the disaster is now a pleasant place to eat lunch or board a water taxi. This isn't callous, it's simply how cities function. They can't remain frozen at moments of tragedy. They have to evolve, adapt, build new functions on old sites. But something persists beyond the forgetting. The descendants still gather at the Bohemian National Cemetery. The historical societies still maintain records. The researchers still investigate the technical details of the capsizing, still argue about the precise sequence of events, still try to understand how a ship capsizes in 20 feet of water. The disaster asks a question that extends beyond its specific circumstances. What happens when everything is done according to the rules and people die anyway? What happens when no one is criminally responsible, but everyone is complicit? What happens when the system itself is the problem, and the system is too large and complex to hold accountable? These questions don't have satisfying answers. They remain open, unresolved, waiting for the next disaster to pose them again in slightly different form. The Eastland is gone. The victims are dead. The witnesses are dead. The perpetrators, if that's even the right word, are dead. What remains is a story, a memorial plaque, a cemetery with 844 names, and a river that keeps flowing past the site where something terrible happened that most people don't remember. The ship wouldn't stay down. It was raised, converted, renamed, and given a second life. But the dead stayed down. They remain in their graves, in family memories, in the historical record. They didn't get a second chance. The question the disaster leaves behind isn't whether anyone was guilty. The trials answered that. No criminal conspiracy existed. Negligence couldn't be proven to legal satisfaction. The system functioned as designed. The question is whether a system that functions as designed and kills 844 people is a system worth maintaining. The answer apparently is yes, with modifications. The river still flows. The modifications were made. The next disaster will be different. And somewhere in 20 feet of water, the ghosts of the Eastland, real or metaphorical, wait for rescue that never came, tap signals no one will answer, and ask questions that remain open.